We therefore do solemnly declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states.
So, in 1776, the assembled delegates of the American colonies declared their independence from England, breaking ties which had bound them to their mother country for almost 170 years. When the news of independence reached New York, a cheering crowd pulled down a statue of the English King George III, and cannons were fired in celebration. Only a few years before, these same people thought of themselves as loyal subjects of George III. How had this startling change come about? England's colonies in America had started as little outposts planted by venturesome Englishmen in the unknown wilderness across the Atlantic Ocean. England itself was a nation with many merchants, ship owners, and small manufacturers who were on the lookout for new markets overseas. Where better to trade than with their own foreign plantations, as the colonies in America were called? As one Englishman explained it,
every act of a dependent colony ought to be to the advantage of the mother state unto whom it owes its being and protection.
to make sure that colonial trade did bring wealth to the mother country, the English Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts. For example, one of the Navigation Acts listed a number of important colonial products which could be sold only to England. The act also said that all trade with the colonies had to be carried in English or colonial ships. Still another act required that all goods which the colonists bought from foreign countries, such as Holland, be shipped first to England. There the foreign goods were taxed, which raised their price. English goods, on the other hand, went to the colonies tax-free, giving them an advantage. Parliament also passed laws to restrict manufacturing in the colonies, so that Englishmen might truly say,
"The American is apparelled from head to foot in our manufactures. He scarcely drinks, sits, moves, labors, or enjoys himself without contributing to the mother country."
The colonists naturally grumbled that these restrictions hindered their growth. But the colonists liked having a monopoly of the English market for their own products, which the Navigation Acts gave them. For example, they could sell their tobacco in England without foreign competition. Moreover, the Navigation Acts were not strictly enforced. The colonists often were able to ignore those which they did not like. As one Englishman explained it to Parliament,
3,000 miles of ocean lie between you and them. Nothing can prevent the effect of this distance in weakening government. Seas roll and months pass between the order and the execution, and the want of a speedy explanation of a single point is enough to defeat the whole system.
even the royal officials in America often closed their eyes to the fact that many colonists ignored the Navigation Acts. They smuggled colonial goods to foreign ports and foreign goods into colonial ports. During the century which followed the passing of the first Navigation Act, the colonists increased in number to more than 1 million people, many of them born in America. Instead of a handful of outposts, There were now 13 substantial colonies along the Atlantic coast. But the colonists still depended on Mother England for protection against the French, who sought control of North America. Let's consider now the value of those colonies which France threatened, and which Englishmen stood ready to defend with their lives. What did England want from her American colonies? How did the Navigation Act serve England's purpose? Were the colonists hurt by their connection with England? Did they benefit? What do you think? In 1763, the situation changed with the end of the French and Indian War. England had won a complete victory, but found herself with a vast new empire to manage. At long last, the English took a hard look at their colonies. They were startled by what they saw.
Why, the Americans take nothing from us which they cannot do without, and they smuggle as fast as they can upon their extensive coasts.
The English colonies have increased so much in their riches that they almost vie with old England.
In contrast, the war had emptied England's treasury and had increased the taxes paid by Englishmen. England's new Prime Minister, George Grenville, decided that it was high time to dust off the old laws regulating the colonies and to pass some new ones. To defend England's new empire properly, an army of 10,000 regular soldiers was to be stationed in America. Since the army was to defend the colonists, England thought that the colonists should help pay for it. By enforcing the Navigation Acts against colonial smugglers, England might raise some money for the new army in America, but not all that was needed. So, Parliament decided on a new tax. From now on, the colonists would have to buy tax stamps to place on all legal documents, diplomas, newspapers, and playing cards. And what did the colonists think about all this? Now that the French were gone, the colonists felt that they no longer needed British soldiers to protect them. They certainly didn't need more customs officers, and the stamp tax was the last straw. Why, the Stamp Act itself was illegal. The Parliament in faraway England might have the right to regulate colonial trade by taxes, but only the colonists' own representatives, whom they themselves had elected to the colonial assemblies, had the right to tax them directly. One reason that the colonists wanted to keep the power to raise money in the hands of their own representatives was because it gave them some control over royal officials. If a royal governor refused to sign a bill passed by a colonial assembly, the assembly might refuse to pay him his salary. Angry meetings were held in the colonies to protest the Stamp Act and to burn the hated tax stamps. The colonists also set up a boycott. That is, they agreed not to buy any goods imported from England until the Stamp Act was repealed. Unable to sell their goods in the colonies, English merchants and manufacturers watched them pile up on the docks. As they lost more and more business, they too urged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in order to end the boycott. A year after the Stamp Act had been passed, a Philadelphia newspaper published an extra edition with the good news that Parliament had given in to the English merchants. Parliament, however, did not give up its claim to authority over the colonies. Instead, Parliament declared,
"The colonies in America are subordinate unto and dependent upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain, and Parliament has full power and authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever."
Soon Parliament tried to raise money in the colonies by placing new taxes on certain imports. These import taxes were called the Townsend Acts. The English claimed that the new taxes were a regulation of trade, like the old Navigation Acts. The colonists protested that the purpose of the Townsend Acts was not to regulate trade, but to raise money by taxation. This was the responsibility of the colonial assemblies and not of Parliament. Once again, the colonists organized a boycott of English goods. An organization called the Sons of Liberty passed out handbills, giving the names and addresses of merchants who continued to import English goods for sale. All liberty-loving colonists were urged not to trade at their stores. The boycott against the Townsend Acts lasted 3 years. One American patriot named Charles Wilson Peel, who was studying painting in London at the time, walked the streets in rags because he refused to buy English goods, even in England. The complaints of English merchants finally persuaded Parliament to repeal all but one of the Townsend import taxes. Parliament, however, kept one small tax on tea to prove that it had the authority to make laws for the colonies. Just as Parliament was repealing the Townsend taxes, there was a clash in Boston between colonists and British soldiers, which left 5 Boston men dead. A silversmith named Paul Revere engraved a dramatic picture of this so-called Boston Massacre. Paul Revere also engraved a design showing 5 coffins with the initials of the dead men: Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus J. Attucks, who was a Negro, and Patrick Carr. Copies of Revere's engravings helped to stir up more resentment against the mother country in the colonies. In Rhode Island, when an English patrol vessel named the Gaspé ran aground on the coast, angry colonists rode out by night and set fire to it as a protest against English enforcement of trade regulations. Then, in 1773, a gang of Boston men wearing Indian costumes challenged the tax on tea by destroying the tea itself. Into the water went 3 whole shiploads sent over by English merchants. To the English government, the Boston Tea Party was a lawless act which could not go unpunished. Parliament promptly passed a series of acts, the first of which closed the port of Boston to all trade. English warships were to keep it closed until the tea destroyed in Boston had been paid for in full. A general in the English Army was named governor of Massachusetts. From now on, the Massachusetts legislature would have less power, and town meetings could be held only with the governor's permission. Still another act reorganized the Canadian province of Quebec and pushed its border south to the Ohio River. The Quebec Act was not intended to punish the colonists, but it did cut them off from the lands they claimed in the West. Moreover, Quebec was to be ruled by a strong governor without an elected assembly. Was this to be the new style of colonial government everywhere? The colonists wondered. Even colonists who had disapproved of the Boston Tea Party could not accept these so-called intolerable acts. Their historic rights as Englishmen were endangered. The colonists' representative in England, Benjamin Franklin, protested in these words:
British subjects, by removing to America, cultivating a wilderness, and increasing the wealth, commerce, and power of the mother country at the hazard of their lives and fortunes, ought not, and in fact do not thereby lose their native rights.
When John Winthrop came to America in 1630 to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he had brought a royal charter which granted the settlers the rights of Englishmen, including an assembly to make their own laws. In 1689, the colonists of the Northeast had revolted against Sir Edmund Andros, a royal governor, who had tried to rule them without paying attention to either the charter or the assembly. The colonists had besieged Andros in his fort at Boston and forced him to surrender his sword and the office of governor because he had ignored their rights. England was the mother of these rights. But now, as Edmund Burke, an English friend of the colonies, put it,
England seems like a porcupine, armed all over with acts of Parliament, oppressive to trade and to America.
when the Virginia Assembly protested against the intolerable acts, the royal governor closed the assembly. On their own, however, the Virginians called for a Continental Congress of delegates from all of the colonies to meet in Philadelphia. Newspapers reprinted an old cartoon which Benjamin Franklin had designed at the time of the French and Indian War. However, the delegates to the Continental Congress still thought of themselves as loyal Englishmen who only wanted their rights. As one said,
I made it a point to contradict and oppose every hint of a desire of independence. A separation from the parent state I would dread as one of the greatest evils.
Instead, the Continental Congress organized another boycott and drew up a declaration of their rights and grievances addressed to the king. But this time, King George and Parliament wouldn't back down. The king said,
I cannot help being of the opinion that with firmness and perseverance, America will be brought to submission.
On the other hand, more and more Americans declared that they would never submit. They formed local companies of militia called Minutemen, ready to fight for their rights at a minute's notice. Minutemen from Bedford, Massachusetts, carried an old flag with the Latin motto, "Conquer or Die," on their way to Lexington and Concord, where they first clashed with English soldiers. As fighting spread from Massachusetts southward to the Carolinas, the Patriots, as they began to call themselves, raised new flags of their own design. But the mottos on the flag showed that they still were fighting for justice, not for independence. The Grand Union flag, which General George Washington raised, had 13 stripes for the 13 colonies, but it also showed the English Union Jack. Washington later reported that forces of the United Colonies had driven the ministerial army from Boston. He meant that he was not fighting against the king, but only against the king's misguided ministers. But in one colony after another, committees of patriots had taken over the responsibilities of government. Other colonists, however, opposed what the patriots were doing and remained loyal to England. One of these loyalists complained in bitter words,
If I must be enslaved, let it be by a king, at least, and not by a parcel of upstart lawless committeemen. If I must be devoured, let me be devoured by the jaws of a lion, and not gnawed to death by rats.
When news reached the Continental Congress that England had proclaimed the patriots guilty of treason and was hiring German soldiers to fight them, Richard Henry Lee, delegate from Virginia, said,
Such actions leave not a doubt, but that our enemies are determined upon the absolute conquest of North America. It is not choice, then, but necessity that calls for independence.
But another Virginia delegate, Carter Braxton, urged delay.
Independence is an object to be wished for by every American, when it can be obtained with safety and honor. This is not the moment. America is in too defenseless a state for the declaration, having no alliance with a naval power, nor as yet any fleet of her own.
Meanwhile, a writer named Thomas Paine was sweeping away the doubts of many colonists with his bold words.
Every quiet method for peace hath been ineffectual. Since nothing but blows will do, let us come to a final separation. Nothing can settle our affairs so swiftly as an open and determined declaration of independence.
In a pamphlet called Common Sense, Paine presented a strong argument for independence.
There is something absurd in a continent perpetually governed by an island. In no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth.
When the Second Continental Congress met in June of 1776, enough delegates favored the idea of independence to adopt a declaration. Adams, Sherman, Livingston, Jefferson, Franklin, Hancock, even doubtful Carter Braxton signed, agreeing with Franklin that it is a true saying, we must hang together or separately. Gone was the Union Jack. In its place would be 13 stars to represent a new constellation of independent states. For the next 7 years, the colonists would fight not only for their rights, but to establish a new nation, the United States of America. Why had the separation come about? The reasons could be found in the Declaration of Independence itself, according to Thomas Jefferson's opening words.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes.